Well, since I'm working on a number of other specials, but none of them are really in fit state to go for this Wednesday's slot, I thought we'd have a look at some of the alternate history questions that have come in, and we'll see how those go. So, alternate history special, let's go. Well, I have a feeling this particular video might become kind of the alternate history Bismarck special, given the sheer number of possible alternate scenarios that for the Bismarck that were asked. But we'll start off with something a little bit different. One of the questions asked was, if the Stalingrad battle cruisers had been built, how would they have fared against Iowa, King George V, or Richelieu-class battleships? I'm going to go with poorly. I mean, they could run away. 35, 36 knots, they definitely could run away, but honestly, the battle cruisers, they've got battle cruiser grade armor, they've got 12-inch guns. Um, any and all of those battleships listed would quite happily have run rampant over any Stalingrad class. Um, yeah, it's not even really much of a contest. I mean, we saw what to be honest, you look at something like, say, the fight between Scharnhorst and Duke of York, it was never an even fight. And the Stalingrads, well, they're slightly more heavily armed than the Scharnhorst. They're not really actually any better protected, if possibly even slightly worse protected in some areas. So we kind of almost have a historical precedent of what would have happened to them. So yeah. Next is, what if Hornet and Enterprise had not been sent off to the Doolittle raid and had instead been present at the Battle of the Coral Sea? Now, this is an interesting one because at the Battle of the Coral Sea, it was a tactical Japanese victory but a strategic American victory um, for the historical battle. Now, with Hornet and Enterprise there, it suddenly goes from the Japanese having a slight advantage in terms of aircraft and carrier decks to the Americans having a decisive advantage. On the flip side, this is early in the war. The Japanese air squadrons are still manned by their veteran, well-trained aircrew, and the Americans are still, to a certain extent, trying to put together their own carrier tactics and learn a bit. Some of their attacks were quite disorganized. However, as the saying goes, quantity has a quality all of its own. And just with the sheer number of extra aircraft you would have got from two large carriers being able to put extra fighters and scouts up in the air, I suspect that would have meant A, the Americans would have found the Japanese carriers sooner, and B, therefore, they would have launched their own attacks sooner, and there would have been more aircraft. And given that the Shikaku and Zuikaku were quite badly damaged by the historical attacks, just throwing those extra attacks in might well have put a number of Japanese carriers on the bottom. So the Americans certainly wouldn't have come out of it lightly. The veteran Japanese pilots would have taken quite a horrific toll, no matter how many aircraft the Americans threw at them. But I think if Hornet and Enterprise had been at Coral Sea, it would have been both a tactical and a strategic American victory, and probably a fairly decisive one. Now, the next question was, what if Germany had completed and put into service the Electroboat submarines a year before they actually did? Well, they'd certainly have hurt, and with the technology that they were deployed with, it did mark a bit of a step change in anti-submarine warfare that the Allies had to scramble to try and match. However, ultimately, it would have hurt, definitely. A lot more ships would have gone down, but I don't think it would have made the greatest amount of difference, mainly because I can't see any real way for them to affect the D-Day landings. And once the D-Day landings are in place and you've got almost a solid picket line of sonar ships supplying the Allied armies in Europe, well, apart from the fact the Red Army's coming the other way anyway, but at that point Germany's fate is well and truly sealed. But I can see probably a lot more warships going down, maybe some more convoys, but to be honest, given that this is Nazi Germany we're talking about, with Allied armies coming in with shore bombardment missions and such, I have a feeling Hitler would probably have insisted that his latest and greatest submarines be directed against the warships, especially the battleships that were shelling his own soldiers' positions. So yeah, it would have made it would have made the conflict a lot bloodier, but I don't think it would have materially affected the overall outcome. We then have another alternate history question: Alaska class versus Scharnhorst class. Now, this one is a real head scratcher. I have had to think about this a lot, and I still can't quite make up my mind. The Alaska class definitely would have the superior fire control system. However, that is a little bit unfair because the Alaska class were effectively completed in 1945. The Scharnhorst class by that point was sunk, so who knows exactly what kind of fire control systems the Scharnhorst could have had by 1945. Okay, fair enough, they probably wouldn't have been quite as advanced as the American ones, but they would have been significantly more capable than the ones the Scharnhorst actually had. Now, in terms of firepower, they both have 3 triple turrets. The Alaskas have 12-inch guns, Scharnhorsts have 11-inch guns. Scharnhorst guns are good, the Alaska class guns are better. However, the flip side to that is that although the Alaska class has a slightly thicker deck, really historically, no matter how good your long-range fire control systems are, long-range engagements don't tend to score that many hits, and both sides always tend to try and close the range down. And this is where the Alaska class maybe falls down slightly in that its belt armor is more in line with its mission as a cruiser killer, whereas the Scharnhorst actually has battleship grade belt armor. So once they start closing the range, the Scharnhorst is going to have a period when it is significantly better protected against the Alaska class's guns than the Alaska class is protected against the Scharnhorst guns, even though the Scharnhorst guns are lighter. That could make a lot of difference. So overall, I'm actually going to say I can't call this one. The Alaska class has a lot of advantages, but that weakness of its main armor belt does give the Scharnhorst an opportunity to get in a sucker punch that would hurt really badly. And once you're fair and you kind of, well, not equalize, but you at least give them both the same period fire control systems, I can see battles going either way. I really couldn't call that, I'm afraid, this time. Another alternate history question: Nelson class versus Iowa or Kongo versus Scharnhorst? Well, these should be interesting. Well, going in reverse order, as I seem to have a habit of doing, Scharnhorst versus Kongo, I'm going to hand that fairly solidly to the Scharnhorst. Now, although Kongo has the bigger 14-inch guns, the fact is Scharnhorst is faster at the time that they're likely to come up against each other, and it's significantly better protected. And that kind of sort of cancels out the fact that Kongo has the bigger guns, because Scharnhorst, okay, fair enough, it didn't do so well against the Duke of York, but the Scharnhorst can, to a degree, take 14-inch hits. Kongo, its armor's not really going to allow it to take that many 11-inch hits, and that one extra gun from Scharnhorst factors up a little bit. Yes, if Kongo hits Scharnhorst hard, it is going to hurt, and that is going to cause problems. But I have a feeling that Scharnhorst is probably going to be the one who hits and keeps hitting, and maybe I'd say 60-40, maybe 65-35 in favour of Scharnhorst. Now, Nelson versus Iowa. Now, this one, the two ships are very, very different. Nelson is more heavily protected. We can't take that away from it. But Iowa does have guns that are going to do more damage. Those 16-inch 50s, they are a bit of a generation ahead of Nelson's. Now, that's not to say that Nelson's guns won't do damage to Iowa. They will. They will hurt quite a bit. I mean, just ask Bismarck how well that goes. Ultimately, really, it comes down to speed. Nelson, unfortunately, in this case, is just far too slow compared to Iowa, which means Iowa can dictate the range of the engagement and the angle of the engagement, and it can decide when and where it's going to fight, when and where it's going to withdraw if things start going badly for it. Nelson, I suppose, to a degree, can just keep its nose pointed in and try and just keep those all its forward guns targeted on Iowa, which makes it a harder target to hit than more conventional battleship that would have to go almost broadside on. And don't get me wrong, if Iowa puts a foot wrong, if Nelson catches it with a full broadside, Iowa's going to get badly hurt, and that might possibly hand the fight to the Nelson. But because the Iowa can dictate the battle, it has to go to the Iowa. Because, yeah, as I say, they've got the opportunity, unless something goes horribly, horribly wrong, to hit when they want to hit, withdraw when they want to withdraw, and if things go badly, they can just pull back, dress their wounds, and try again. Nelson just doesn't have that opportunity, and its guns are the lighter guns. All right, and the last question before we get into the Great Bismarck debacle was what would have happened if the Japanese had instead attempted to invade Hawaii in 1941 rather than just attack Pearl Harbor. Now, obviously, with the Pearl Harbor attack pulled off, in terms of the heavy firepower you would need to repel an invasion fleet, Pearl Harbor then obviously wouldn't have it. The Japanese would have battleships offshore with their heavy fire support. They would have the carriers with their fighters, etc., etc. The main problem that they would have, however, is logistics. The Japanese pushed their logistics chain to the limit to get their Pearl Harbor force that they actually did get there to a position where they could launch the attacks. Going those extra few hundred miles and taking along enough troop transports, bearing in mind which will also all need refueling, to run a meaningful invasion, the Japanese just don't have the logistics to do it. And if you kind of hand waved it and maybe said, I guess maybe they try an Operation 10 Go style, right, you're going there, and kind of you either succeed or die trying. Yeah, I guess in theory they could try that. However, they would face the rather obvious problem that I'm pretty sure any American commander faced with an actual Japanese invasion, assuming that the troops available at Pearl Harbor are unable to hold off the attack, which in an Operation Tengo scenario where you've got a significant portion of the Japanese battle line sitting there lobbing heavy 14 and 16-inch shells at them, I can see that kind of firepower breaking the American defenders. But all it would take would be one clever person to go, oh, there's a bunch of fuel oil depots here, and that's basically the only chance the Japanese have ever got of getting home. And a couple of demolition charges later, and the Japanese fleet is pretty much stuck. At which point they're out of the war. I guess the Japanese could try and send a massive fleet of oilers, but with the majority of the Japanese fleet's combat power stuck at Pearl Harbor without fuel, they're going to be very easy pickings. And then the Americans can just sort of circle and shoot them at will. So, yeah, if they'd gone Operation 10 Go style, they might have been able to pull it off, purely in terms of can we invade Pearl Harbor and Hawaii in general. But it would actually have been a far, far worse outcome for them within the space of a few weeks. And so we're on to the medley of Bismarck questions. So let's start with an easy one. What would happen if Graf Zeppelin had managed to go with Bismarck and Prince Eugen? Well, honestly, for the initial parts of the Bismarck's voyage, not a lot of difference, because bear in mind there was an awful lot of fog involved, so you really, really do not want to try carrier operations in the 1940s, especially in the early 1940s, in a North Atlantic fog in the middle of the North Atlantic. That's a very, very easy way of sending up a lot of planes and not getting any of them back. But it would have forced the Royal Navy, obviously knowing that that ship was out there, it would have forced them to call in their own aircraft carriers. So you probably would have seen Ark Royal called up from Gibraltar. Obviously, Victorious was around as well. Um, Navalised Messerschmitt 109s, assuming they'd got them in service by that point instead of the Heinkel 51s. Um, they the Messerschmitt 109s individually would have been qualitatively superior to the fighters that the RAF could have, the Royal Navy, sorry, could have put up from their own carriers. The Royal Navy carriers would have been able to put up more. Um, the limitations of the Graf Zeppelin would hurt it a fair bit, I think. Overall, I have a feeling the two British carriers would probably cancel out the Graf Zeppelin. Um, the biggest single problem the Graf Zeppelin would have would be that with just Bismarck and Prince Eugen around, um, it's a bit stuffed when the British capital ships show up because either it sticks in the battle line, in which case somebody's going to go, oh, free kill, or it tries to hang back and away, in which case the cruisers that were shadowing the whole thing go, oh, look, free kill. The Graf Zeppelin sailing out along with the Bismarck and Prince Eugen, there's just not enough escort forces. It's not how carriers should work. And if you want to know how well carriers fare in the capital ship battle, well, the fate of the Glorious against Scharnhorst and Gneisenau pretty much answers that question. Moving to the other end of the operation, basically we're sort of going in escalating differences from the original timeline. If Bismarck had managed to escape and make it to France, I guess probably not taking that torpedo to the stern, what would have happened then? Well, there's an awful lot of possible scenarios, and with Bismarck and Prince Eugen making it to France, most of them involve the RAF trying to carpet bomb them out of existence. But then again, the RAF tried to carpet bomb Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prince Eugen out of existence to a relatively poor set of results. Um, so that's not necessarily a particular mark against. Now, you would have Scharnhorst and Gneisenau ready to go shortly thereafter. Given the Nazis' way of doing things and the Kriegsmarine's way of doing things, I can see them actually going with something more along the lines of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau's historical operation that would eventually wind them back up in France along with Prince Eugen. But with Prince Eugen and Bismarck trying to break out at the same time, so kind of a pincer movement where Scharnhorst and Gneisenau head north and Bismarck and Prince Eugen head straight back out into the Atlantic. Now that would have really thrown the Royal Navy for a loop, assuming, of course, that the fact that Bismarck was physically present in France didn't radically alter the Royal Navy's own deployments. But that is probably the scenario I can see most likely being happening. And the Royal Navy would have been quite hard pressed to do much. I mean, they might have tried to stick a sort of a permanent submarine blockade somewhere around the coast of France. But historically, a lot of their convoys at the time when German capital ships were coming out were escorted by the older battleships, things like the R class and such, simply because they knew that if you had something like a Deutschland class or a Scharnhorst class show up, they were probably likely to decline battle with something that was carrying 8 15-inch guns. Bismarck wouldn't. And that kind of obviates the entire strategy. You'd either have to put your modern King George V class out on convoy escort duty, or Nelson and Rodney was doing convoy escort duty at the time. But even then, outside of Nelson and Rodney, you don't know. Hood would have had to go back into refit. But outside of Nelson and Rodney, you'd probably actually have to send like 2 battleships with each convoy, and that would have really put a crimp in the convoy operations, and of course, would have provided a lot of very juicy targets opportunity for U-boats. So that's actually probably one of the biggest butterflies. That's the kind of scenario I can see shaking out. How it would have gone down after that, I don't know. And I think it would be impossible to tell, but it definitely would have meant a lot of interesting times for the Royal Navy in the North Atlantic. Whiplashing back to the beginning of the Bismarck's career again, the question was asked, how would the Imperial German Navy have turned out if they were able to maintain their fleet post-Great War and been included in the Washington Naval Treaty? And then obviously that knowledge of building new ships would have been continued, and then the Bismarck would have looked very different. Yeah, the Bismarck would have looked quite different. I suspect whatever the Bismarck class would have turned out to be probably would have had triple turrets. Um, they were kind of the up and coming thing of the period. It's just the Germans didn't have any experience with that kind of scale of gun turret using triples. Um, how the designs would have evolved? Well, one would hope the Germans would have dropped the turtleback armor. Yeah, it's fantastic if you're fighting a short-range punching action in the North Sea, um, but as the Bismarck's loss rather proved, it's a terrible thing to have when you're facing any kind of significantly long-range fire. So, turtleback armor probably would have gone. Um, hopefully, with their developed knowledge of how to build and maintain warships, it wouldn't have been as oversized. Um, so, but if they're in the Washington Naval Treaty, they would have been more inclined to stick with the treaty limits. So I suspect you might see something along the lines of either an upscaled Scharnhorst with triple 15s, or some kind of cross between that and the Littorios. That kind of sort of fast, triple 15-inch armed battleship. Yes, technically would have been in violation of the naval treaties, but I don't think the Germans would have gone for triple 14s. They don't really seem to have that much experience with those kind of guns. Um, but hey, yeah, they would have broken with the naval treaties eventually. So yeah, something like a Bismarck, a theoretical Bismarck of that type, probably 35 to 40,000 tons, um, three triple 15-inch turrets, and maybe a slightly better secondary battery as well. Right, and the last two, these are kind of the juicy ones. So the first one is kind of a combination combination video. What am I talking about? Combination question. Um, One is hypothetically, if the hood hadn't taken the shell hit in exactly the location it did that killed it, would it have been a closer match for the Bismarck? And that's sort of coupled with another question, which was what would have occurred if Hood had started her turn to port 30 seconds earlier. So let's take the two together because that kind of gives us a plausible scenario for how this happens. So Hood turns to port 30 seconds earlier. That's given the flight time of shells, that's pretty much almost simultaneous with the Bismarck actually firing. So that salvo is going to miss. And the Germans are going to have to work to reacquire the range. Now, the Germans had the range on the Hood, and so it wouldn't have taken more than maybe one or two salvos to reacquire the range, whereas the Hood had not yet straddled Bismarck. So the Germans, unless Hood got lucky in the next sort of two or three salvos and started getting the range right, the Germans probably would have gotten a few more hits in on the Hood. However, with the Hood having worked its way into a closer range and turned semi-broadside on, its angled 12-inch belt would have provided it with a certain degree of protection against Bismarck's fire. Not necessarily the belt would have kept the 15-inch shells out, but they certainly would have detonated them well before they could hit anything vital, like, say, a magazine. And without that magazine hit, Hood is a very big ship. It has the sheer mass to soak up some incoming fire. Now, obviously, it's already damaged. It's already had possibly some of its ready-use 4-inch ammunition cook off. So it's definitely not coming out of this unscathed. But it's now able to unleash its full broadsides. And of course, you have Prince of Wales, and then it is two full battleships, albeit one very old, one very new, versus Bismarck and Prince Eugen. Now, at this point, the battle could actually go quite significantly in multiple directions. So you could have what you might call the theoretical worst case scenario, at least as far as the Hood is concerned, which is Hood is now standing in a slugging match with Bismarck. Bismarck gets some of its hits in ahead of Hood. Hood doesn't explode, but is hit quite badly. Crippled, speed slowed, forced to pull out of line. That actually puts the Prince of Wales in a worse position because although Hood can still technically engage it, with whatever armament it has remaining, it is very much a sort of I guess sort of like a millstone around the Prince of Wales's neck. Because with the Hood blown up, the Prince of Wales was free to retreat when it saw necessary. With the Hood crippled, the Prince of Wales is going to feel a lot more obligated to stick around and defend the flagship. And if the Hood is quite badly out of action and possibly slowly sinking after a lengthy gunfire exchange, then Prince of Wales may stick around long enough to start taking some bad hits. However, Prince of Wales is fairly well protected, and I don't think they'd be stupid enough to stick around long enough for them to also be sunk. And I feel that assuming they didn't just concentrate fire on the Bismarck, Prince Eugen probably would have got shot up quite badly, if not sunk itself. But Prince of Wales would almost certainly have been forced to retire, or if through stubbornness they stayed around, there's a possibility that they might have also gone down as well with the sort of turret jams and such that it was suffering. So that's your worst case scenario for that situation. Now, your best case scenario for that situation, realistically, as I said, is Hood possibly still takes one or two hits from the Bismarck. However, Bismarck's gunnery and fire control system did have a habit of degrading as the battle went on, for various technical reasons outlined by a couple of respected naval authors. And the Bismarck had managed to knock out its own radar, which was not helpful. So anyway, best case scenario, Prince of Wales switches its fire to Prince Eugen. Hood trades fire with Bismarck, takes a couple of hits, but is able to survive and keep firing. Prince of Wales then cripples or destroys Prince Eugen, or drives Prince Eugen off into the waiting arms of Suffolk and Norfolk, at which point Hood has almost certainly by this point acquired the range and is hitting Bismarck equally hard. As we know from Bismarck's final battle, any kind of hits, even if they don't penetrate the Bismarck's belt or armour deck, are very likely to sever vital systems like the fire control communications. So all it would take really would be one lucky hit from Hood or possibly Prince of Wales, and Bismarck's fighting capacity would have been significantly reduced to the point that its gunnery would have become almost worthless. And then you would have had a kind of similar slugging match to how Bismarck historically went down, where you'd have Prince of Wales desperately trying to keep its turrets operational and a damaged Hood just blasting away at Bismarck's superstructure and belt just trying to put it down. And bizarrely enough, given that Rodney gave a good go of torpedoing Bismarck, Hood also has torpedo tubes, so you might end up with Hood torpedoing Bismarck, which would be an interesting scenario. So you'd end up with Bismarck sunk, Prince Eugen sunk, and a battered, damaged Hood coming home triumphant and victorious and being stuck promptly in a dockyard for the much needed refit that it was going to get under the guise of repairs. So that's your best case scenario. And then your sort of vaguely realistic middle of the road scenario would probably have been something along the lines of Prince of Wales probably hitting and driving off Prince Eugen. I don't think, in a scenario where Hood survives any particular length of time, I don't think Prince Eugen's going to live, because it's either going to try and fight a stand-up fight with Prince of Wales, which it's going to lose, or it's going to have to be driven off, and when it's driven off, Suffolk and Norfolk can just double team it, because Bismarck's going to be too busy to help. So Prince Eugen's going to go down, or possibly surrender, I suppose. Not to be captured, but it might just surrender in order to preserve some of the crew, and then it'll just slip under the water later on. Bismarck at that point is going to take a bit of a pounding. It will dish out damage in return. most probably to Hood, because Hood is the biggest ship, it's the bigger target, it's the flagship as well. So Hood and Bismarck kind of slug it out, with Prince of Wales trying to assist in between guns jamming, etc. But with Prince of Wales coming into force, and probably at that point Suffolk and Norfolk, once they've finished off Prince Eugen, also lending weight of fire, Bismarck is going to have to take the only route it can do out, which is going to be to use its superior speed to break off. And with Hood probably damaged and unable to keep up anyway, if a badly damaged Bismarck is breaking off, then Prince of Wales probably isn't going to pursue, more in favour of looking after Hood. And without Hood sunk, the kind of vindictive rage where everybody was zoomed in to try and kill it is not going to be around as much. So assuming that Bismarck's engines are still vaguely intact, it has a much better chance of getting back to France. Whether or not it could be repaired in France and then put back into service, or whether it just end up maybe doing a channel dash or something, don't know. Of course, with its in its damaged state, it may well be then caught by Fleet Air Arm aircraft and crippled in such a way that it may be finished off later on in a manner similar to historical. But again, sort of Hood gets back and goes into refit, comes out in its new configuration. So those are kind of the that would be the most plausible middle of the road scenario I can see for that particular situation. And finally, the big one, and this is probably going to push the video a little bit over the time limit that we have for dry dock episodes, but hey, it's an alternate history episode. We could dealing with a lot of questions at once. What would have happened if Bismarck had been escorted by its originally intended fleet, with Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, Prince Eugen, and you know what the hell, throw in Tirpitz as well, because that's where all these kind of questions generally lead. Yeah, so 2 Bismarck class, 2 Scharnhorst class, and the Prince Eugen tagging along, looking a bit forlorn. Well, the first and most obvious answer is the Royal Navy is not going to be dumb enough to just send Hood and Prince of Wales out. That's not going to happen. The Royal Navy are many things. Stupid is not one of them. Now, looking at the ships the Royal Navy did actually have in the area, there was Ramillies, an R-class in the Western approaches, but I don't think they would have taken Ramillies, purely because as an old R-class, its speed just wouldn't have been up to being tactically useful. Now, with that kind of force massing in Germany, they would not have deployed their ships exactly as historical. So going from what they had at the beginning of 1941 in the area, apart from Ramillies, you have Queen Elizabeth in Rosyth. That definitely would have been brought in. You have King George V, obviously. You have Repulse and Hood. And you then also have Nelson and Rodney, and at the time of the sailing, obviously, you have also Prince of Wales just coming online. Now, that's actually quite the interesting matchup, because you have 2 King George V class, and you also then have Hood and Repulse, and that's sort of a fast element of the fleet that could conceivably catch up with the German fleet. Nelson and Rodney do make this scenario tilted in favour of the Royal Navy, assuming that they can actually catch up. Now, the one problem with Nelson and Rodney is they are significantly slower, so it would make interception, if they all sailed together, a much harder job, and would also mean that once they actually got there, if they managed to intercept, the Germans could just go, well, we're leaving, and leave Rodney and Nelson behind. If they had the tactical flexibility and opportunity to actually pull that off. I think, given the sheer force of battleships that are going out, then you almost certainly would have seen Nelson and Rodney sail, even as sort of as part of a backup force. But yeah, I think you would have had a fast task force of King George V, Prince of Wales, Hood, and Repulse sailing out with obviously various heavy cruisers and such to take on the German ships. Now, that's a very interesting matchup, because you have the 2 King George V's versus the 2 Tirpitzes, 2 Bismarcks even. what the hell am I on? And then you have Hood and Repulse versus Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. This shapes up potentially to be a very interesting fight, because we know Scharnhorst and Gneisenau combined, when they fought the Renown, were not particularly enamoured with that fight. Repulse, okay, yes, it's Renown's sister ship, but it's not as well upgraded, but you have Repulse and you have Hood. And for all the lucky hits that Bismarck got in on Hood, it's not going to happen with the 11-inch guns of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. So the Germans would be at a disadvantage facing off that half of the fight. Now, Bismarck and Tirpitz obviously would have been brand new, so sort of, yeah, I guess you could say Tirpitz versus Prince of Wales, two brand new ships. The two British ships between them have 4 extra guns, but they're 14-inch guns. They are more heavily protected than Bismarck and Tirpitz, but Bismarck and Tirpitz have those individually superior 15-inch guns. That is going to be a really interesting fight when everyone's intact and one ship on each side is kind of new to the fight. That would be a fight that I would pay good money to see. There are some weaknesses in the King George V design, but they're pretty solid ships. It's going to depend on if they can actually get some hits in. If they can get some hits in, unfortunately, again, the Bismarck suffer this annoying weakness with their turtleback armour of having their fire control communication systems, cabling and such, above the armour deck. So any kind of significant hits, or good solid hits that the two British ships land anywhere kind of in the midsection, they don't actually have to penetrate any significant armour to do serious damage to the combat capability of the German ships. So, overall, in that kind of fight, although obviously, as kind of the fight with Hood proved, luck of the draw can make an awful lot of difference, but on paper, it's going to be a hard-fought fight. But I think the Royal Navy is going to edge it. It's going to be an epic clash, no doubt about it. But I can't see Scharnhorst and Gneisenau standing up to Hood and Repulse for any significant length of time, especially since the Royal Navy would have probably sortied a whole swarm of heavy cruisers, which obviously would have initially dealt with Prince Eugen, but then also would come in support. And I think with Scharnhorst and Gneisenau probably either having to fall back and away, or possibly even being damaged enough to be sunk by Hood and Repulse, then Hood and Repulse can obviously turn their fire to assisting against Bismarck and Tirpitz, and that fight against the two King George V is even enough that I think they'd probably still be fighting at the time the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau have been sorted out by Hood and Repulse, and then you've got 4v2, and then it's a bit of a foregone conclusion at that point. And then, of course, probably if you've got, I mean, I don't think any of the German ships would die easily, but they probably could be rendered combat ineffective. Then at that point, whilst the damaged British ships are trying to figure out what they should be doing, then you'd have sort of Nelson and Rodney rolling up with the rear echelon squad, and then probably using their 16-inch guns and possibly even their torpedoes to just finish them off. So yeah, I kind of really want to see that fight, or maybe model it. Maybe I'll ask my wargaming group to do that, or if any of you guys out there have any of the better digitized fire control naval wargame simulators, like Atlantic Fleet or something, maybe we can set that up and see what would happen. That would be an interesting one. Yeah, so anyway, that wraps up the alternate history special, aka the Bismarck special, and hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you've enjoyed my little ramblings there, and it provides some interesting thoughts about how we could possibly look at alternate history going forward. And yeah, I'm going to shut up now because we're nearing 40 minutes, and I will see you in another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to tag your question with Q&A if you want to leave a question for the dry dock.